Dr. Kim Nari pressed her face against the cold metal window of the research ship Hanbok and watched the stars drift by like tiny diamonds scattered across black silk. She had been studying alien life forms for 7 years now, but space still made her feel small and amazed. The ship was quiet except for the soft hum of the engines and the distant sound of her colleague Lee Jinho typing reports in the next room. Nari was small even by human standards. She stood barely 5 feet tall with thin arms and gentle hands. That seemed better suited for holding books than fighting battles. Her black hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same plain gray jumpsuit as everyone else on the crew. Most people who met her thought she looked more like a student than a doctor of xenobiology. She preferred it that way because it meant aliens and humans alike tended to ignore her while she observed and learned. The Hanbok was not a big ship, but it was home to 12 researchers and crew members. Captain Park Do-yun ran the ship with quiet efficiency, while his team explored the outer edges of known space, looking for new forms of life. They had been out here for 3 months now, and had cataloged 17 new species of space-dwelling organisms. It was peaceful work that Nari loved. She was reviewing data on a strange bacterial sample when the alarms started screaming. Red. Lights flashed throughout the ship, and Captain Do-yun's voice echoed through the speakers telling everyone to get to emergency stations immediately. Nari had never heard panic in the captain's voice before, but she heard it now. Jinho burst into her lab with his eyes wide and his face pale. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door while shouting that unknown ships were approaching fast, and they looked hostile. Nari felt her stomach drop as she followed him through the narrow corridors toward the bridge. The ship suddenly shook violently, and she heard the terrible sound of metal being torn apart somewhere above them. The bridge was chaos when they arrived. Captain Do-yun was shouting orders while his crew tried desperately to get more power to the shields and weapons. Through the main viewing screen, Nari could see 3 massive alien ships that looked like giant insects made of dark metal and sharp edges. They were easily 10 times bigger than the Hanbok, and they moved through space with predatory grace. One of the crew members screamed that the shields were failing, just as another impact shook the ship so hard that Nari fell to her knees. Emergency. Lights flickered, and she could hear air hissing out through cracks in the hull. Captain Do-yun was trying to send a distress signal, but static filled the communications system. The alien ships moved closer, and Nari got her first clear look at the creatures that would change her life forever. They called themselves the Vorthak, and they were nightmares given form. Each one stood over 8 feet tall with 4 arms ending in razor-sharp claws. Their heads were elongated like insects with huge compound eyes that reflected light in horrible ways. Most terrifying of all were their mandibles that clicked together constantly while green acid dripped from their mouths. The Vorthak had been terrorizing this part of the galaxy for decades. They conquered entire worlds, not for resources or territory, but for the simple joy of hunting and killing. They collected the strongest specimens from each species they encountered and forced them to fight in gladiatorial arenas for entertainment. The weak ones were simply eliminated immediately. Captain Do-yun tried to fight, but the Hanbok's small defensive weapons were useless against the massive alien ships. The hull was breached in multiple places, and Vorthak soldiers began pouring through the gaps wearing environmental suits that made them look even more terrifying. They moved with insect-like coordination, and their weapons fired bolts of energy that could cut through metal and bone with equal ease. The crew tried to resist, but they were scientists and researchers, not soldiers. One by one, Nari watched her colleagues fall to the alien invaders. Some died quickly from energy blasts, while others were taken alive for reasons she did not want to think about. Jinho tried to protect her by pushing her behind a console, but a Vorthak soldier spotted them and fired a stunning blast that dropped him unconscious. Nari found herself alone and surrounded by creatures that had featured in her worst nightmares since childhood. She had studied reports about the Vorthak, but seeing them in person was completely different. They were bigger and more terrifying than any description could convey. Their acid breath filled the air with toxic fumes, and their claws left deep scratches in the metal floor wherever they walked. The largest Vorthak wore elaborate armor decorated with bones from various alien species. This was clearly their leader, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like grinding metal mixed with insect chittering. He examined the surviving humans with the cold interest of a scientist studying specimens. Most of the crew members were unconscious, from stun blasts, but a few were awake and trembling with fear. The leader, whose name was Hive Lord Kethrix, walked among the prisoners and made quick decisions about their fates. The stronger crew members, like Captain Do-Yun, were marked for gladiatorial combat, while others were designated for biological experiments. Each decision was made with casual efficiency, as if he were sorting packages rather than determining the fates of living beings. When Kethrix reached Nari, she was sitting quietly against a wall, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. Her strategy had worked her entire life, but now it caught the alien leader's attention in a way she had not expected. He tilted his massive head and studied her with all four of his compound eyes, while his mandibles clicked thoughtfully. Kethrix had seen thousands of alien species during his long career of conquest, but humans were relatively new to him. Most of the humans he had encountered were soldiers or colonists who fought back with typical mammalian aggression. This small female was different, though. She showed no signs of the usual fear responses and seemed to be observing him as much as he was observing her. The Hive Lord made a decision that would prove to be the biggest mistake of his long life. Instead of killing Nari immediately, or sending her to the experimental labs, he decided she would make an interesting psychological study. He wanted to see what would happen when the weakest possible prey was placed among the galaxy's most dangerous predators. It seemed like it would be amusing entertainment. Nari was separated from the other survivors and dragged to a different transport ship. She caught one last glimpse of Jinho being loaded onto another vessel before heavy doors sealed her fate. The Vorthak guards who escorted her seemed almost bored as they pushed her into a cramped cell barely large enough for her to lie down. The walls were covered in scratches from previous occupants, and the air smelled of fear and death. During the long journey to their destination, Nari had time to think and plan. She used her scientific training to analyze everything she could observe about her captors. She studied their movement patterns and social hierarchy and biological needs. Most importantly, she began to understand that the Vorthak saw her as nothing more than entertainment. They expected her to die quickly and horribly for their amusement. This was their first mistake, but it would not be their last. The transport ship finally arrived at its destination after what felt like weeks of travel. Nari was roughly pulled from her cell and got her first look at the Crimson Arena. It was a massive structure that seemed to be grown rather than built, with organic walls that pulsed with their own heartbeat. Thousands of alien spectators filled the viewing areas, while bioluminescent displays showed betting odds and fighter statistics. She was processed like cargo and given a simple prisoner uniform before being shoved toward the holding areas. The guards spoke about her in their clicking language as if she could not understand them, but Nari had been studying xenolinguistics for years. She caught enough words to know they were betting on how long she would survive. Most gave her less than an hour. As the massive doors to the holding complex opened, Nari took a deep breath and stepped forward into darkness. She could hear growling and chittering and the sound of claws scraping against stone from somewhere in the shadows ahead. The air was thick with the smell of predators and death and fear. The doors slammed shut behind her with a sound like thunder, and she found herself alone in the dark with monsters that had been specifically chosen to kill anything they encountered. The Vorthak guards above were already placing their bets and preparing to enjoy the show. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. The holding complex was a nightmare made real. Nari stood in complete darkness for several minutes while her eyes adjusted to the dim bioluminescent lighting that pulsed from the organic walls like a slow heartbeat. The air was thick and humid, with an overwhelming stench of death and fear and something else she could not identify. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of heavy breathing and claws scraping against stone. As her vision cleared, she began to make out the layout of her new prison. The complex was enormous, with tunnels and chambers stretching out in all directions, like a vast underground maze. The walls were not made of metal or concrete, but seemed to be grown from some kind of alien coral that oozed a thick slime. Everything was organic and alive in a way that made her skin crawl. The first creatures she encountered were the Razor Fangs. They emerged from the shadows like living nightmares, with bodies covered in metallic fur and mouths full of serrated teeth that gleamed in the dim light. Each one was about the size of a large wolf, but they moved with pack intelligence that made them far more dangerous than any Earth predator. Their eyes glowed red in the darkness, and they communicated through soft, chittering sounds that somehow conveyed complex tactical information. The pack leader was larger than the others, with scars covering his face and one missing eye that spoke of countless battles. He approached Nari slowly with his head low and his lips pulled back to show rows of razor-sharp teeth. The other pack members spread out to surround her while making the chittering sounds that she was beginning to recognize as hunting coordination. Nari stood perfectly still and watched them approach. Her scientific training had taught her to observe first and react second, even in dangerous situations. She noticed that the pack leader kept his damaged eye turned away from her, and that he favored his left front leg slightly. More importantly, she observed that the other pack members were looking to him for leadership signals and would not attack until he gave the command. Years of studying predator behavior had taught her that most hunters preferred easy prey that would run or fight predictably. Instead of screaming or trying to escape, Nari did something that confused the Razor Fangs completely. She sat down, cross-legged on the stone floor, and began humming softly while examining her surroundings with calm curiosity. The pack leader stopped his advance and tilted his head in confusion. His prey was supposed to run or cower or fight back, but instead, she was acting like she belonged here. This was not normal behavior, and it made him uncertain about how to proceed. The other pack members sensed his confusion and held their positions, while waiting for clearer instructions. While the Razor Fangs debated what to do about her, Nari continued her observations. She mapped the visible tunnel entrances and noted which areas seemed to have better airflow. She identified several loose stones that could serve as weapons and marked the locations of what appeared to be old bloodstains on the walls. Most importantly, she listened carefully to the sounds coming from other parts of the complex. The stone crushers were impossible to miss. Each footstep sounded like a small earthquake, and their breathing was so deep that it seemed to shake the walls. When one finally came into view, Nari understood why they had earned their name. The creature stood nearly 10 feet tall and appeared to be made entirely of living rock. Its body was covered in mineral deposits that formed natural armor, while its hands could probably crush steel without effort. The stone crusher ignored both Nari and the Razor Fangs as it lumbered past them toward what appeared to be a feeding area. She noticed that it moved slowly but with unstoppable momentum like a living avalanche. More importantly, she observed that it used chemical markers to communicate by leaving scent trails that other stone crushers could follow. The third type of predator was far more disturbing than the others. The shadow stalkers were nearly impossible to see even when you knew they were there. They seemed to phase in and out of visible reality, like living shadows that could strike from any direction without warning. Nari only became aware of them when she noticed that some of the other creatures were constantly looking over their shoulders and flinching at sounds that she could not hear. During her first night in the complex, Nari learned the social hierarchy through careful observation. The stone crushers were at the top of the food chain due to their size and power, but they were slow and not very intelligent. The shadow stalkers were feared by everyone, including the stone crushers, but they seemed to prefer hunting alone rather than establishing dominance. The Razor Fangs fell somewhere in the middle and made up for their smaller size through pack tactics and intelligence. The alien spectators watched everything through bioluminescent viewing ports that dotted the walls and ceiling. Nari could see their silhouettes pressed against the organic windows as they observed the interactions between predators and placed bets on various outcomes. She realized that this was all entertainment for them, and that her death was expected to be amusing rather than meaningful. On the second day, the Razor Fang pack leader finally decided to test the strange, small prey that had appeared in his territory. He approached her again, but this time he brought the entire pack with clear hunting intentions. Nari had been expecting this moment and had spent hours preparing for it while the aliens above watched with growing interest. She had found a sharp piece of stone that fit perfectly in her small hand and had studied the pack leader's movement patterns until she knew exactly how he would attack. When he finally lunged forward with his mouth open and his claws extended, Nari moved with precision that surprised everyone watching, including herself. Instead of dodging backward like normal prey, she stepped forward and to the side while driving the sharp stone deep into the pack leader's damaged eye socket. The blow was perfectly aimed and delivered with enough force to penetrate his brain instantly. He dropped dead without making a sound, while his pack stared in shock at the small creature that had just killed their alpha with a single strike. The remaining Razor Fangs had never seen anything like this before. In their society, the strongest always led and the weak always died, but this tiny, soft creature had just defeated their most powerful member, using intelligence and planning rather than strength or speed. They began backing away from her while making confused, chittering sounds that conveyed fear and uncertainty. Nari wiped the blood from her makeshift weapon and looked directly at the remaining pack members. She had learned enough of their body language to communicate basic dominance signals, and she used them now to establish her new position in their hierarchy. The Razor Fangs were intelligent enough to understand that she was now their leader, and that resistance would likely result in death. The alien spectators above went wild with excitement. Their betting pools had been completely upset by this unexpected development, and new wagers were being placed frantically. Most had expected the human to die within minutes, but instead, she had just demonstrated tactical thinking and combat skills that impressed even experienced gladiator fans. Hive Lord Kethrix watched the events unfold from his luxury viewing box with growing interest. He had expected this to be a brief and amusing execution, but the small human was proving to be far more entertaining than anticipated. He decided to extend the experiment and see what other surprises she might provide. Over the following days, Nari continued to establish her position in the complex ecosystem. She used her knowledge of animal behavior to predict and manipulate the actions of the various predators around her. The stone crushers were easy to redirect by laying false scent, trails that led them away from areas she wanted to explore. The shadow stalkers were more challenging, but she learned to detect their presence by watching for the subtle fear reactions they caused in other creatures. The Razor Fang pack became her unwitting allies through a combination of intimidation and careful resource management. She led them to food sources and helped them avoid the more dangerous predators while gradually training them to respond to her signals. They began to see her as a strange but effective alpha who used planning and intelligence instead of brute force. The alien audience was fascinated by the developing social dynamics. Never before had they seen a prey species take control of predators through pure psychological manipulation. Betting pools became increasingly complex as spectators tried to predict what the human would do next and how the various creatures would respond to her actions. Nari was aware that she was being watched constantly, but she used this to her advantage. She began performing actions specifically designed to confuse and disturb the alien observers, while slowly gathering information about the complex layout and security systems. Every day she learned something new about her captors and her environment, while they focused on the entertainment value of her survival. By the end of her first week in the arena complex, Nari had achieved something that no other gladiator in the facility's history had ever accomplished. She had not just survived among the galaxy's most dangerous predators, but had actually gained a measure of control over them. The small, quiet scientist who had been thrown away as worthless entertainment was becoming something that even the Vorthak guards were beginning to watch with nervous interest. Something dark was growing inside Nari, and she could feel it changing her in ways that both fascinated and terrified her. The polite scientist who had spent years studying alien life from the safety of research labs was disappearing piece by piece. In her place, something primal and hungry was emerging like a predator shedding its skin. She had been in the arena complex for 3 weeks now and had not just survived, but begun to thrive in ways that disturbed even her. The Razor Fang pack followed her commands without question, and she had learned to use them as extensions of her own will. When she pointed at a target, they attacked without hesitation. When she made certain sounds, they retreated, or advanced, or spread out to surround prey. She had become their alpha through intelligence and ruthless efficiency. The stone crushers had proven easier to manipulate than she had expected. Their chemical communication system was relatively simple once she understood the basic patterns. By using organic materials to create false scent markers, she could lead them anywhere she wanted them to go. More importantly, she had learned to use their territorial instincts to clear areas of other predators when she needed space to work. But it was her interactions with the shadow stalkers that truly showed how much she had changed. These creatures had evolved to be the perfect ambush predators with abilities that bordered on supernatural. They could phase partially out of normal reality to avoid detection and strike from impossible angles. Most of the arena's inhabitants lived in constant fear of them. Nari had solved the Shadow Stalker problem through a combination of careful observation and calculated brutality. She had spent days mapping their movement patterns and learning to predict when and where they would attack. Then she had set traps using their own abilities against them. When a Shadow Stalker tried to ambush her from a phased state, she was ready with a specially prepared weapon that could affect creatures existing between dimensions. The first time she killed a Shadow Stalker, the alien spectators fell silent in shock. These creatures were considered nearly invincible and had been the undisputed apex predators of the complex for years. Yet this small human had not only detected one, but had killed it using tactics that no one had ever seen before. The betting pools went wild as spectators tried to adjust their understanding of what they were witnessing, but Nari was not content to simply defend herself anymore. Something primitive and hungry had awakened in her mind, and it wanted more than survival. It wanted dominance. It wanted to hunt not because she had to, but because she could. The civilized part of her mind watched in horror as this new aspect of her personality grew stronger each day. She began marking territory in ways that would have been unthinkable to her old self. After killing predators, she would arrange their bodies in specific patterns that sent clear messages to other creatures in the complex. These were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned psychological warfare designed to establish fear and respect. The message was simple and terrifying in its clarity. This area belonged to her now, and anything that entered without permission would die. The Razorfang Pack became the instruments of her expanding influence. She trained them to hunt in coordinated patterns that maximized efficiency and minimized risk. Under her guidance, they learned to use tools and set traps and work together in ways that their species had never developed naturally. She was not just their leader, but their teacher, and they were learning lessons that would make them far more dangerous than they had ever been before. The alien observers were beginning to realize that something unprecedented was happening in their arena. This was no longer simple survival entertainment, but the emergence of a new kind of predator that operated on principles they did not understand. The human was not just adapting to the environment, but actively reshaping it according to her own vision of how things should work. Hive Lord Kethrix watched the developments with growing unease. He had expected the human to provide brief amusement before dying in some entertaining fashion, but instead she was becoming something that challenged his understanding of predator dynamics. More disturbing was the fact that she seemed to be enjoying the transformation. There was something in her movements and expressions that suggested she was not fighting against her circumstances, but embracing them. Nari had discovered something about herself that years of civilized living had hidden. Humans were not naturally peaceful creatures who happened to be good at violence when necessary. They were apex predators who had learned to suppress their hunting instincts through social conditioning and cultural pressure. Remove those constraints and something terrifying emerged from the depths of their evolutionary past. She began hunting, for sport rather than necessity. The complex had feeding systems that provided adequate nutrition for all its inhabitants, but Nari found herself stalking and killing creatures simply because she could. The act of hunting triggered reward systems in her brain that felt better than anything she had ever experienced. Each successful kill made her feel more alive and more powerful than she had ever imagined possible. The psychological transformation was as dramatic as the behavioral changes. The quiet scientist who had always preferred books to confrontation was becoming someone who looked forward to violence with anticipation and pleasure. She found herself thinking about new ways to kill and more efficient methods of establishing dominance. The academic mind that had once analyzed alien behavior with detached curiosity now planned hunting strategies with predatory focus. Her relationship with the Razorfang Pack evolved from simple leadership to something more complex and disturbing. She began to see them not as allies, but as tools to be used for her own purposes. When pack members showed signs of independent thinking, she eliminated them quickly and efficiently. The surviving members learned to obey without question and to anticipate her needs without being told. The stone crushers became unwitting guardians of her territory through careful manipulation of their chemical communication systems. She created scent barriers that directed them to patrol specific areas while avoiding others. They believed they were following their own territorial instincts, but were actually serving her strategic objectives without realizing it. Even the remaining shadow stalkers began to avoid areas where she had established control. After she killed several of their kind using tactics they could not understand, they developed what could only be described as superstitious fear of the small human. They would phase out of reality entirely rather than risk encountering her in areas she had claimed. The alien spectators were no longer enjoying simple entertainment, but witnessing the birth of something that made them profoundly uncomfortable. This human was not behaving like prey or even like a typical predator. She was demonstrating levels of intelligence and adaptability that suggested capabilities far beyond what their species profiles had indicated was possible for mammals. High-ranking alien nobles began arriving to observe the phenomenon firsthand. Representatives from a dozen different species came to see the creature that had achieved impossible dominance over the arena's ecosystem. They watched with growing alarm as Nari demonstrated hunting techniques and leadership abilities that seemed to violate everything they thought they knew about evolutionary biology. The transformation accelerated as Nari's confidence grew. She began venturing into areas of the complex that had been considered too dangerous for any single creature to enter. These were territories controlled by apex predators that had never been successfully challenged. One by one, she invaded these areas and either killed the existing inhabitants or forced them to submit to her authority. Her methods became increasingly sophisticated as she learned to combine psychological warfare with tactical brilliance. She would study a target for days or weeks before making her move, then execute her plans with precision that left no room for escape or retaliation. Each victory made her stronger and more confident, while adding to the growing legend that was spreading throughout the arena complex. The alien guards began reporting unusual behavior among all the creatures in the holding areas. Predators that had been stable for years were showing signs of stress and fear. The carefully maintained ecosystem that had provided reliable entertainment for decades was being disrupted by the presence of a single small human who refused to die according to schedule. Nari was aware of the attention she was receiving, but she no longer cared about the opinions of her captors. The scientist who had once worried about making good impressions and following proper protocols was gone. In her place was something primitive and powerful that cared only about dominance and survival and the intoxicating rush of successful hunting. She had become the apex predator of a complex designed to house the galaxy's most dangerous creatures, and she was just getting started. The Vorthak had created the perfect environment for unleashing the darkest aspects of human nature, and now they were beginning to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. But it was already too late to undo what they had done. The monster they had created was growing stronger every day, and soon it would outgrow the cage they had built to contain it. When that happened, the entire galaxy would learn what humans were really capable of when all the civilized restrictions were stripped away. Hive Lord Kethric stood in his luxury viewing chamber and watched the small human move through the arena complex with predatory grace that made his chitinous skin crawl. 6 weeks had passed since he had thrown her into the holding areas as amusing prey, and she had transformed into something that challenged everything he thought he knew about galactic hierarchy. The entertainment had become a nightmare, but his scientific curiosity would not let him end it. The human had achieved total dominance over an ecosystem that had been designed to kill anything thrown into it. Creatures that had terrorized the arena for decades now cowered when she approached or fled entirely from areas she had claimed. More disturbing was the fact that she seemed to be enjoying every moment of her transformation from civilized scientist into apex predator. Kethrix decided it was time to escalate the situation. He wanted to see what would happen when the human was pushed beyond her apparent limits. The first test would be mechanical rather than biological. He ordered his technicians to release a squadron of hunter-killer drones into the complex. These machines had been designed specifically to eliminate problematic gladiators and had never failed to complete their missions. The drones were sleek metallic predators that moved through the air on nearly silent repulsors while scanning for targets, with multiple sensor arrays. Each one was armed with energy weapons that could cut through armor and equipped with shields that could deflect most attacks. They operated with hive intelligence that made them almost impossible to outmaneuver or defeat through conventional tactics. Nari detected the drones within minutes of their arrival through changes in the behavior of creatures throughout the complex. Animals that had been moving normally suddenly began hiding in deeper tunnels, while others displayed stress behaviors that indicated the presence of aerial threats. She had learned to read the ecosystem like a book, and these signs told her that something new and dangerous had entered her territory. The first drone she encountered was hunting alone in one of the feeding areas. It detected her immediately and began tracking her movements while charging its weapons systems. Instead of running or hiding, Nari did something that confused its programming completely. She stood perfectly still and watched it approach while showing no signs of fear or aggression. When the drone was close enough to guarantee a killing shot, Nari suddenly moved with inhuman speed and precision. She had been studying the hunting patterns of shadowstalkers for weeks and had learned to partially mimic their ability to phase between dimensions. The drone's energy blast passed through empty air, while she materialized behind it with a weapon made from salvaged arena debris. The modified spear she carried had been crafted specifically to penetrate mechanical armor, using techniques she had observed from various alien species. One perfectly aimed thrust disabled the drone's power core and sent it crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks. Within minutes, she had stripped it of useful components and added them to her growing arsenal of improvised weapons. The remaining drones adapted their tactics, but Nari adapted faster. She used the Razor Fang pack to create distractions while she flanked the machines from unexpected angles. She employed Stone Crusher territorial behavior to create environmental hazards that damaged or destroyed the mechanical hunters. Most impressively, she learned to use the arena's own bioluminescent viewing ports as weapons by redirecting energy beams to overload drone systems. Within 3 days, every hunter-killer drone had been destroyed or disabled. The alien spectators watched in stunned silence as their most advanced mechanical predators were systematically eliminated by a creature they had dismissed as harmless prey. The betting pools collapsed entirely, as nobody knew how to calculate odds for something that seemed to violate all known parameters. Kethrix escalated again by introducing environmental hazards to the complex. Poison gas was released into certain areas, while others were flooded with acid or subjected to extreme temperature variations. These were designed to force the human into increasingly desperate situations where she would eventually make fatal mistakes. Instead, Nari used her scientific training to analyze each new threat and develop countermeasures. She created breathing filters from organic materials and identified safe zones where environmental systems could not reach. More importantly, she learned to use the hazards as weapons against any remaining creatures that still challenged her authority. The alien observers were beginning to realize that they were not watching normal predator behavior, but something far more sophisticated and terrifying. This human was not just surviving impossible challenges, but was actively learning from each encounter and becoming more dangerous with every passing day. The final escalation came when Kethrix decided to introduce other humans into the complex. He had been holding them in separate facilities while studying their individual characteristics and psychological profiles. Now he ordered them brought to the main arena to see how the transformed human would react to members of her own species. The first group included Lee Jinho, her former research partner, and Captain Park Do-hyun from the original ship crew. They were accompanied by several other humans who had been captured during various raids on colonial settlements. All of them had been told they were being moved to better accommodations and had no idea what they were actually walking into. When the doors opened and the new prisoners were pushed into the complex, they found themselves in a nightmare that defied description. The holding areas that had once housed dozens of apex predators were now eerily quiet, with only scattered bones and bloodstains marking where the former inhabitants had died. Strange scent markers covered the walls, while improvised weapons and tools suggested the presence of intelligence far beyond what should have been possible in a gladiator facility. Jinho called out for Nari, hoping that his colleague had somehow survived and would help them understand their situation. When she finally appeared from the shadows, he barely recognized her. The quiet scientist he had known was gone, replaced by something that moved with predatory confidence and watched them with calculating eyes that seemed to evaluate their potential usefulness. Nari looked at the new arrivals and felt something she had not experienced in weeks. These were her people, her own species, and for a moment the civilized part of her mind reasserted itself. She remembered who she used to be and what her old life had been like before the arena had stripped away her humanity and revealed the predator beneath. But the moment passed quickly. The transformation had gone too far and too deep to be reversed by simple recognition. When she looked at Jinho and the others, she did not see friends or colleagues but potential assets in her ongoing campaign of dominance. They were tools to be evaluated and either used or discarded based on their utility to her objectives. The alien spectators expected her to show mercy or at least recognition toward members of her own species, but instead they witnessed something that chilled them to their cores. Nari approached the new humans with the same calculating assessment she had applied to every other creature in the complex. She was not planning to save them, but to determine how they could serve her purposes. Captain Do-yun tried to take charge of the situation, using his military training and natural leadership abilities, but he quickly discovered that the chain of command no longer existed in this place. When he attempted to give orders, Nari ignored him completely while the Razor Fang Pack responded to subtle signals from her that established clear dominance relationships. The other humans were confused and frightened by what they found. They had expected to encounter their missing colleague in need of rescue, but instead they found an apex predator who had created her own kingdom in the depths of hell. She offered them a choice that was no choice at all. They could prove their usefulness to her objectives, or they could face the arena's remaining hazards alone. Most of them submitted to her authority out of desperation and fear, but a few tried to resist. Those who challenged her were dealt with, swiftly and efficiently, in ways that left no doubt about the consequences of disobedience. She had become something beyond human understanding, and anyone who failed to recognize this reality would not survive long enough to learn from their mistake. Under her guidance, the human survivors began learning to hunt and kill with coordinated efficiency that impressed even the most experienced alien observers. They were not just fighting for survival, but actively enjoying the process of becoming predators. The transformation that had taken Nari weeks to complete was accelerated in the others through direct teaching and careful psychological manipulation. Within days, the small group of human survivors had become a unified hunting pack that operated with tactical sophistication beyond anything the arena had ever seen. They used tools and traps and psychological warfare while demonstrating adaptability that allowed them to overcome any challenge thrown at them. The alien spectators were no longer entertained, but genuinely frightened by what they were witnessing. These humans were not behaving like any other species they had ever encountered. They were demonstrating capabilities that suggested they might be far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Kethrix watched from his viewing chamber and began to understand that he had made a terrible error in judgment. The entire Vorthak nobility had gathered to witness what their Hive Lord promised would be the final resolution of the human problem. 8 weeks had passed since the small scientist had been thrown into the arena complex as disposable entertainment, and the situation had spiraled far beyond anyone's expectations. What had started as amusing predator dynamics had become something that threatened the fundamental order of galactic civilization. Hive Lord Kethrix stood before the assembled crowd in his finest ceremonial armor, decorated with trophies from 100 conquered worlds. His forearms gleamed with weapons that had never failed him in personal combat, while his chitinous carapace bore scars that told the story of his rise to power through strength and cunning. He had decided to enter the arena personally and restore his species' reputation through direct action. The viewing galleries were packed with alien dignitaries from across the galaxy who had come to see the creature that had achieved impossible dominance over their most advanced gladiatorial facility. Representatives from the crystalline hegemony sat beside delegates from the gaseous confederacy, while military observers from a dozen species took notes for their respective intelligence agencies. Below in the arena complex, Nari moved through her territory with the confident grace of an apex predator in complete control of her environment. The transformation that had begun with desperate survival had evolved into something that would have been unrecognizable to her former colleagues. She was no longer the quiet scientist who had preferred books to confrontation, but something primal and terrifying that had embraced the darkest aspects of human nature. Her pack of converted humans followed her with absolute loyalty born of fear and respect and shared experience. Captain Do-hyun had become her tactical advisor while Jin-ho served as her intelligence analyst. The others filled specialized roles in her growing organization, each contributing skills that made the group more effective than the sum of its parts. They had transformed the arena complex into something that resembled a military base more than a holding facility. Weapons and tools crafted from salvaged materials filled hidden caches throughout the tunnels, while improved fortifications protected key areas from attack. Most importantly, they had established communication systems that allowed coordination across the entire facility. When Kethrix entered the arena through the main gladiator gates, he expected to face a desperate creature fighting for survival. Instead, he found himself in a carefully prepared killing ground where every surface and shadow had been optimized for ambush tactics. The human and her pack were nowhere to be seen, but he could feel their presence watching him from hidden positions throughout the complex. The Hive Lord called out challenges in several languages while displaying his weapons and armor to intimidate any watching enemies. He had defeated thousands of opponents in personal combat and expected this encounter to follow familiar patterns. The human would either fight directly and die quickly or try to run and die slowly. Either way, the outcome was predetermined by his superior size and strength and experience. Nari watched him from a concealed position and felt something she had not experienced since her transformation began. This was not just another predator to be eliminated, but the architect of her suffering and the symbol of everything she had lost. The scientist in her analyzed his movements and equipment, while the predator in her planned his destruction with anticipatory pleasure. When the attack came, it was unlike anything Kethrix had ever experienced. Instead of a single opponent charging at him with primitive weapons, he found himself facing a coordinated assault that utilized the entire arena environment as a weapon. Explosions disabled his shields, while carefully placed obstacles channeled his movements into predetermined killing zones. The human pack attacked with tactical sophistication that impressed even military observers in the viewing galleries. They used diversionary tactics and suppressing fire while maintaining communication through signals that seemed to convey complex information instantly. Each member knew their role and executed it with precision that suggested extensive training and preparation. Kethrix quickly realized that this was not a gladiatorial contest, but a military engagement against opponents who had turned his own arena into a fortress. His weapons and armor that had always guaranteed victory were being systematically neutralized by enemies who had studied his capabilities and prepared countermeasures for every advantage he possessed. The decisive moment came when Nari herself finally appeared for direct combat. She carried weapons that had been specifically designed to penetrate Vorthak armor, while her movements demonstrated mastery of fighting techniques that no human should have been able to learn. More disturbing was the expression on her face, which showed not desperation or fear, but predatory anticipation. The fight was brutal and one-sided, but not in the way anyone had expected. Kethrix found himself being systematically dismantled by an opponent who seemed to know exactly how his species fought and what weaknesses could be exploited. Every attack was precisely aimed, while every defense was anticipated and overcome through superior preparation and tactical thinking. When the Hive Lord finally fell, it was not with the dramatic flourish of gladiatorial tradition, but with the efficient brutality of a predator eliminating a threat. Nari stood over his broken body and looked up at the viewing galleries where thousands of alien spectators watched in stunned silence. The message was clear and terrifying in its implications. The assembled alien nobility finally understood what they had been witnessing. This was not an anomaly or an entertainment malfunction, but a demonstration of what humans were capable of when pushed to their limits. The small, quiet scientist had not become something inhuman, but had revealed capabilities that had always existed within her species. Commander Choi Min-ho of the human colonial fleet arrived with a rescue squadron just as news of Kethrix's defeat spread throughout the Vorthak Empire. His ships had been searching for survivors from dozens of raids when they detected the unusual energy signatures coming from the arena complex. What they found when they boarded the facility challenged their understanding of what their own species could become. The arena complex had been completely transformed into a human stronghold where former prisoners had not just survived, but thrived in an environment designed to kill them. The Vorthak guards were either dead or had fled, while the facility's most dangerous predators had been eliminated or driven away by creatures that should have been their prey. Min-ho found Nari in what had once been the main gladiator preparation area but was now clearly a command center. She stood surrounded by salvaged equipment and improvised weapons while her pack of converted humans monitored systems throughout the complex. When she turned to look at him, her eyes held depths of experience that seemed impossible for someone who had been missing for only 2 months. The commander asked if she was ready to come home, but her response made it clear that the concept of home had changed for her. She looked out at the vast galaxy beyond the arena walls and smiled with an expression that combined human intelligence with predatory satisfaction. The quiet scientist who had once studied alien life from a safe distance was gone forever. When she spoke, her words carried implications that would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. The Vorthak Empire had made the mistake of assuming that humans were typical prey species that could be safely conquered and enslaved. Instead, they had discovered that humans were apex predators who had simply been constrained by their own civilization. The rescue ships departed with their recovered personnel, but they also carried something far more significant. They brought proof that humanity possessed capabilities that no other species had suspected, and that these capabilities could be awakened through the right circumstances. The galaxy would never look at humans the same way again. In the months that followed, the arena incident became a case study for alien military academies and political institutions. The transformation of Dr. Kim Nari from captured scientist to apex predator demonstrated that humans were far more dangerous than their peaceful colonial expansion had suggested. Other species began reassessing their relationships with humanity, while military planners developed new strategies for potential conflicts. The Vorthak Empire never recovered from the psychological impact of seeing their most powerful warrior defeated by what they had considered worthless prey. Their expansion slowed and eventually stopped as other species began to question whether the predators they had feared for so long were actually the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. Nari herself became something of a legend among both humans and aliens, though few understood the true implications of her transformation. She had proven that when civilization was stripped away and survival became the only priority, humans could become something that made the galaxy's apex predators look like prey. The quiet scientist, who had once preferred books to confrontation, had discovered that when pushed to their limits, humans did not just adapt to become better prey. They adapted to become better predators than anything else the galaxy had ever produced. And that revelation changed everything.